Then we have Native American art. And the biggest problem when studying Native American art is the forms have changed dramatically. Really, they change between about 1870 and 1920. And the reason is, as the Europeans move the Native Americans onto the reservation, they take away a lot of the materials that would have been used in their earlier forms of art. So the art completely shifts. They're also lacking general resources, so they have to make use of anything they have. And after the 1920s, the forms of art that we see are really forms of art that are created based on those materials that are given, or based on sort of, I'm using air quotes here, appropriate and sanctioned forms of art for the Native Americans. That's where we get a lot of this beadwork and other things that were not particularly early tradition in all the groups where we see it today. So we are dealing with ledger paintings, and these are a very specific form. By the 1890s, Native Americans are forced entirely onto reservations. And they didn't have a lot of materials, so they would get this discarded ledger paper and pencils from the army clerks. And this ledger paper, it becomes more obvious here, is really paper used for accounting. And the clerk on the reservation will make a mistake, for example, or that page is no longer necessary, so they'll simply give the paper to the Native Americans, who will use it along with colored pencils to create art. And these were very specific. Often they're drawing personal exploits, or they're drawing images of their history, elements of their culture. They're very aware, the Native Americans at the time are very aware of what's happening, that they're losing their culture, they're losing their heritage, so they're trying to record a lot of it. And some of it is for their own records, but a lot of it is actually done for an American audience. If I go back for a second and look at this piece, this is really the only historical piece we have from Custer's Last Stand, a major mystery in history, because we don't know what happened in those last few minutes. And yet we have this ledger painting that seems to give us some feel for what was happening at that last moment. So they're recording their history, their heritage. Oftentimes these pieces are sold specifically to Americans. So a lot of these still exist, and they're incredibly valuable today. We're talking six figures for many of them. So the piece we're actually looking at is the honoring song at Painted Teepee from the Julian Scott Ledger. In other words, this is a collection of drawings that were done. And here we see a group of dancers before 3 teepees. And we have a couple of things that I need to point out. First of all, we're going to look at this teepee here. This is probably a warrior's teepee. For example, we have what appears to be a dismembered arm and a dismembered leg. That doesn't mean that the warrior is necessarily going out and dismembering people, but this would relate to something he did on the battlefield, and this dismembered limb becomes a symbol of it. We also see these pipes. These are a very specific type of pipe, which would again speak to some element of his character. This could be a chief, and these are peace pipes. It could be a number of different things. The other teepee that's painted here is particularly interesting. That one is probably a shaman's teepee. As we look at it, we have these black figures with bird heads, and we have birds underneath. And then we have one figure that stands out, this red figure that seems to be much smaller. More than likely, this belongs to a shaman. Those black figures being figures that he's seen in a hallucinogenic or dream state. This state of unconsciousness or hallucination where he would be able to speak to the gods and communicate with deity. And oftentimes they're seeing these dream states. This is part of what will make them shaman. And these are also the medicine men, the wise men of a tribal group. And something that's falling off rapidly as we move the Native Americans onto the reservations, because they have modern Western medicine The idea of the shaman is too closely linked to Native American culture, and therefore it will be removed systematically by the Europeans and the Americans. The dancers are wearing traditional clothing. In the front row, we have a mix of men and women. In the second row, it's all women. And in the back row, we have a mix. And they're wearing traditional clothing. So this is all speaking to traditions from before the reservation period. These pieces will die out rapidly because there are resources that will be provided to the Native Americans. Again, those more acceptable forms of art that we see. So, for example, they'll be given wool for weaving, or beads, or leather, things that they did work with, but not in this modern form, nothing like what we see, say, today. If you travel to South Dakota or North Dakota and purchase Native American art, it's not really Native American art because it's passed through, that tradition has passed through a filter on the reservations. The ledger paintings are sort of that last end of the traditional forms where they're recording what they used to do. They're recording their culture, fully aware of what's going to happen. And then we get that more modern form today, those acceptable art forms today.